Sometimes you reach a point in life where there's nothing left to explain, no apologies to make, no justifications to invent. You simply leave. And when you do it quietly, without warnings or dramatic goodbyes, something powerful happens. Your absence begins to speak louder than any words you might have said. The curious thing is that it's not an act of revenge, but of liberation. It's like turning off a television you've been watching for years without enjoyment, just out of habit. And in that instant, you discover the luxury of hearing your own silence. I'm Gabriel, and for more than 15 years I've studied and practiced Stoicism as a way of life. I've guided hundreds of people around the world to live with wisdom, virtue, and, above all, courage. Because true courage doesn't always reveal itself by shouting or arguing, but by knowing when to walk away when there's nothing of value left to hold on to. And in that act of leaving without saying anything, invisible forces are set in motion that change your mind, your body, and your spirit. Often, what we fear most, the loneliness, the emptiness, the what will people say, is exactly what we need most to find ourselves again. On this journey, I will take you to discover 15 things that happen when you choose to disappear silently from someone's life. 15 realities they may never have told you, but that are the key to stop living in chains and begin walking in peace. I'll do it with stories, philosophical reflections, a bit of modern psychology, and the wisdom left by the ancient Stoics. And above all, I'll do it with you, accompanying you every step of the way. Let's begin. Number 1, you break the power dynamic. There's something fascinating about how the silence dynamic works. When you decide to leave without a word, you break a circle that seemed endless. That game of manipulation, of reproaches, of empty apologies and promises that are never kept. The other person expected your reaction, your anger, your never-ending explanation. But suddenly, there's nothing. Only emptiness. And in that emptiness, the person who used to feed on your responses loses their fuel. It's like turning off the TV in the middle of a soap opera. The story can continue, but you're no longer watching it. You're no longer giving it ratings. And then the plot loses its strength. I remember a day when, in the middle of a long, exhausting argument, I simply got up from the table, took a deep breath, and walked out the door. There were no shouts, no explanations, just an awkward silence. What happened next? The other person got stuck in their own echo. That was the moment I understood that sometimes the most powerful answer is the one that isn't given. And yes, in the moment it can seem cold, even cruel. But the truth is, it's liberating. Because every game needs two players. And if you stop playing, the board loses its meaning. Marcus Aurelius said that no one can force us to participate in what we do not want. Choose not to be harmed, and you won't be. I read that years ago in his meditations, on a day when I felt someone had too much control over my emotions. It was as if a window opened for me. I understood that I didn't have to be available for someone to manipulate my energy. Silence, in that sense, is not emptiness. It's a shield. Now, this act is not meant to show the other person that you've lost your patience or to manipulate them back. No, here the center is you. It's your way of reminding yourself that you don't have to explain every boundary you set, nor justify your peace. In silence lives a kind of dignity that words sometimes ruin, because an explanation opens doors, and silence closes them without the need for a lock. I want you to ask yourself something. How many times did you keep playing a game you knew was lost just because you couldn't tolerate the silence? That fear of the void made you prolong arguments, tolerate behaviors, and give second chances that no longer made sense. But when you decide to be quiet and walk away, something different happens. The power changes hands. It's no longer the other person who sets the rules of the game. You're the one who breaks it. Think of it this way. When the curtain falls in a theater, the play is over. The actors can stay behind the stage, but there's no audience. That audience was you. And when you leave, there's no performance. That's the power of leaving in silence. The stage goes dark, the energy fades, the power play ends. And the deepest part of it all is that it's not an act of revenge, but of liberation. You don't need to announce your departure with an epic speech, nor wait for applause or reproach. Just walk toward the door and don't look back. Because silence not only breaks the power game, it also opens the space for you to reclaim your own. Number 2, you hand back the mirror. When you disappear in silence, the other person is left standing in front of a mirror they never asked for but can't avoid. Your absence forces them to see themselves without the distraction of your words, without excuses or arguments where they once found shelter. There's no one left to blame, no wall to bounce their reproaches against, only the reflection of who they truly are. And that hurts more than any lecture. Carl Jung spoke of the shadow, that part of ourselves we hide because we don't want to accept it. When you were present, your presence acted as a screen where the other person projected their shadow, their guilt, their emptiness, their insecurities. But when you choose silence, that screen disappears, and suddenly they have nowhere to project. They're forced to face what they always tried to deny. Let me tell you something. Years ago, I worked with a woman who had been trapped for decades in a relationship where her husband blamed her for every failure. If only you hadn't done this. If only you were different. The story was always the same, until one day she decided not to respond anymore. No shouting, no explanations, just a long silence. And she told me later. At first he tried to pick fights, but then he began to go quiet, as if he didn't know what to do with his own anger. That was the first time he saw himself in the mirror without filters. Silence, in that sense, is an act of self-love, but also an act of truth. Because no one can look at themselves forever without eventually discovering something they'd rather ignore. And yes, many can't stand it. They fill that emptiness with another person, with distractions, with noise. But what matters is that you're no longer the one carrying someone else's shadow. You're no longer the one holding up an unfair game. Here's a simple exercise I want to suggest. Divide a sheet of paper into 3 columns. In the first, write the criticisms or reproaches you heard most often. In the second, ask yourself, does this reflect something real in me, or is it the other person's projection? And in the third, write how you could respond to yourself with compassion without needing anyone else to confirm it. Writing is like holding a mirror, but this time you're holding it for yourself, not for someone else. The beauty of this process is that by no longer being someone else's mirror, you reclaim the right to be your own reflection. You no longer define yourself by what another projects onto you, but by what you discover in your own gaze. And there, believe me, lies a strength that needs no explanation. Because silence, more than absence, is a return to yourself, to your truth, to your purest reflection. And when you let the other see themselves without your intervention, you give back something they could never manipulate, the rawness of their own mirror. Number 3, you regain peace of mind and energy. When you choose to disappear in silence, you're not only freeing yourself from the other person, you're freeing your mind from constant noise. Being in a toxic relationship, in a bond filled with arguments, complaints, or hostile silences, is like living with a radio switched on all day at the same frequency, a hum that never stops. The moment you decide to walk away and stop responding, the first thing you reclaim is peace of mind. That silence, which once felt unbearable, turns into a balm that soothes your nervous system. I experienced it in a very simple way. I remember the first night after setting a final boundary in a draining relationship. No messages to check, no calls to answer, no explanations to rehearse in my head. I slept 8 hours straight, something I hadn't done in months. That morning I realized the body stores everything. The insomnia, the muscle pain, the fatigue. They were only symptoms of a mind worn out by constant friction. Silence became medicine. And here modern psychology comes in. The nervous system lives on alert when you're subjected to constant fights or manipulation. That hypervigilance turns into exhaustion, stress, even physical illness. By disappearing in silence, you switch off that inner alarm. It's like you've been running with a weight strapped to your back and suddenly you set it down. The path hasn't changed, but now you can walk it lighter. I want to suggest something practical. Give yourself 48 hours with no contact, no justifications, no attempts to fix anything. In that time, set 3 simple routines. First, take care of your sleep. Go to bed early without screens. Second, breathe deeply for 10 minutes after waking up, just to feel your body. And third, write down what you feel, even if it's only fragments of sentences. This small protocol is a reset. You don't need more to start noticing how your anxiety drops and your clarity rises. And now I want to invite you to something special. If what you're hearing resonates with you, if you feel these words are helping you in some way, subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. That way, I can make sure we keep walking together in this process. And tell me in the comments which country you're connecting from. I'd love to know where this community of wisdom seekers is coming together. Because peace of mind is not a luxury, it's a vital necessity. And silence, far from being emptiness, is the doorway to that peace. When you disappear without words, your mind begins to rest, your body regains energy, and your spirit finds space to breathe. That is the true gift, rediscovering that silence is not absence, but a home where you can finally dwell in calm. Number 4, your boundary becomes clear without arguing. One of the greatest drains in any conflictive relationship is the need to explain over and over again where your boundaries are. Don't talk to me like that. Don't ignore me. Don't lie to me anymore. And yet, the more you explain, the less your words seem to be respected, as if your explanations were taken as invitations to negotiate. And that's the mistake. A true boundary isn't argued, it's shown. When you disappear in silence, your boundary is marked with a clarity no explanation could ever match. I remember a time when I fell into the same pattern, defending my point of view, repeating why a certain behavior hurt me. In the end, I was exhausted, left with the feeling that I was talking to a wall, until I understood something obvious but powerful. Explaining without action is giving the other person permission to keep crossing the line. That day, I decided I wasn't going to explain anymore. And yes, of course there was surprise. Of course there were complaints. Why aren't you answering? Why don't you say anything? But that very reaction showed me that, for the first time, the boundary had become real. Epictetus put it brutally simply: don't explain your philosophy. Live it. When I first read that phrase in my youth, I believed I needed the strongest arguments to defend my decisions. Today I understand that silence, backed by action, speaks louder than any speech. And in relationships, your silent departure is a practical demonstration of dignity. Picture an everyday scene. Imagine someone sends you a message full of reproaches or emotional blackmail. Your automatic reaction would be to respond, to clarify, to defend yourself. But what happens if you don't reply? What happens if the message just sits there, unanswered? What used to be a battlefield turns into a monologue, and in that monologue, your boundary reveals itself with an undeniable force. If you want to practice this, here's a simple inner script. Every time you feel the urge to respond and justify yourself, repeat to yourself, I don't need to explain my piece. My silence is already my answer. This doesn't mean you don't have the right to speak. It means you're not obligated to turn every conversation into a trial, because your life is not a courtroom. The boundary drawn in silence is a powerful reminder. You are no longer available for games or excuses. And while at first the other person may see it as coldness or arrogance, over time they'll realize what you actually did was reclaim your self-respect. Silence is that invisible wall that protects your calm. By disappearing without arguing, you don't just mark where the other person ends, you also mark where you begin. And that discovery is one of the bravest acts you can take in life. Because few things are as clear as a boundary that doesn't need words to be understood. Number 5, you don't need closure to heal. One of the most common traps when a relationship ends is the obsession with so-called closure. We crave that final conversation that explains everything: why it happened, what we did wrong, what the other person thinks, if there was still love, if there was something worth saving. But the truth is, closure almost never comes, and when it does, it rarely brings peace. More often, it brings more confusion, more contradictory words, more wounds torn open again. I fooled myself with that idea too. I remember a time in my life when I wrote a very long letter, full of arguments, reproaches, and even a touch of nostalgia. I was ready to deliver it, convinced that it would set me free. But at the last moment, I didn't. I tucked it away in a drawer. Days went by, then weeks, and one day I realized something surprising. Not sending it had given me more peace than any reply ever could. Writing it out had let me release what was weighing me down, but by not delivering it, I gave myself the gift of keeping my silence. The Bible puts it simply and wisely in Ecclesiastes 3:7. There is a time to be silent and a time to speak. The problem is, we almost always believe it's time to speak, that we need that last scene to make the movie make sense. But life is not a movie with end credits. Life is more like a series of episodes that keep going even when a character disappears. Stoicism reinforces this view. What doesn't depend on you cannot be your source of peace. And the closure you're waiting for does not depend on you, because it relies on the words, intentions, and willingness of someone else. Clinging to that is like waiting for rain just because you want to hear it fall. You could wait your whole life, and in the meantime, you'd be missing your own sunny days. If you ever find yourself trapped in that waiting, try this exercise. Write down everything you wish you could say, uncensored, with anger if needed, with tears if they come. Then put the paper away or burn it. That symbolic act is worth more than any unfinished conversation, because in that moment, you remind yourself that the only person who truly needs to hear you is you. The most freeing part of leaving in silence is realizing you don't need the other person's permission to heal. Closure happens when you decide to stop dragging invisible chains. And yes, there may be a void of unanswered questions, but that void is also space to grow, to laugh again, to feel light once more. Stop searching for perfect endings. The perfection of closure lies in your decision to stop needing it. The true ending doesn't arrive with explanations. It arrives with your silence. And that silence, though it may feel heavy at first, slowly becomes the purest medicine for the soul. Number 6. You change the narrative in your favor. When you leave in silence, the story that once seemed written by someone else starts to take a different turn. Before, you were the dramatic one, the difficult one, the one to blame for everything. There was always a label stuck to your name because you were there to respond, to defend yourself, or to explain. But when you choose to stay quiet and disappear, the narrative slips out of their hands. It becomes a blank space they can't control, and that's where you reclaim your power. Psychology explains it well through the principle of scarcity. What becomes inaccessible gains more value. When you're no longer there, your absence begins to weigh more than your presence. And that doesn't mean you become some kind of trophy. It means the other person is left without a story to lean on. You're no longer the available villain. Now you're a mystery. And mystery, believe me, is more powerful than 1,000 explanations. I saw this very clearly once on social media. Someone I knew had ended a very public relationship, and instead of posting hints or explanations, she simply stopped posting anything at all. Weeks of absolute silence. The impact was immediate. While the other person couldn't stop writing and justifying themselves, she stood out precisely by saying nothing. She didn't need a speech to show strength. Her silence was the most powerful statement. Do you see the paradox? When you stop giving reasons, the other person keeps searching for them everywhere. And often they end up inventing their own versions, trapping themselves in their contradictions. You, on the other hand, don't have to do a thing. You just keep moving forward and the story begins to rewrite itself in your favor. It happened to me personally as well. For years I thought that if I didn't clarify my position, I would be judged unfairly, until I learned that other people's judgment is never under my control. The irony is that when I went quiet, many began to wonder, why isn't Gabriel responding anymore? That silence, far from sinking me, gave me a dignity my words had never achieved. And of course, there's always room for a touch of humor in all this. Because if you think about it, we live in a time where people post even what they had for breakfast. In the middle of so much noise, the most revolutionary act is to stay quiet. Walking away from drama is almost like telling the world, you know what? I don't have time for this. I'm busy living my life. That's the power of changing the narrative, letting your actions, or your absence, say what words never could. Your silence becomes a message that cannot be manipulated, because the story is no longer told by them. You're the one telling it. Number 7. You learn to be alone, without feeling lonely. There's a fear that touches almost everyone: loneliness. We were taught from childhood that being alone is something negative, a synonym for abandonment or failure. But when you choose to walk away in silence from a relationship that drains you, you discover something surprising. Loneliness is not an enemy, it's a teacher. You begin to distinguish between being alone and feeling lonely. Being alone can be a nourishing choice, a space for reconnection with yourself. Feeling lonely, on the other hand, is the emptiness of depending on someone who never gave you what you needed. I remember a stage in my life when, after ending things with someone very important, I felt a huge emptiness. It was as if suddenly the hours of the day had multiplied, and I didn't know what to do with so much silence around me. But little by little, that silence became fertile. I walked without headphones. I listened to my own thoughts. I found myself cooking calmly, writing down scattered ideas in a notebook. And I understood something Marcus Aurelius practiced with discipline, writing to see himself with honesty. He didn't fear solitude because he always carried an inner refuge, his thoughts, his values, his philosophy. I want to suggest a 7-day solitude workshop. It's not about isolating yourself from the world, but about practicing the art of being with yourself. One day, dedicate it to walking without hurry, observing your surroundings in detail. Another, write yourself a letter as if you were your best friend. Another, prepare a special meal just for you, with the same care you would for someone you love. Small gestures like these tell your mind, my company is enough. In these practices, a deep truth appears. Loneliness stops being lack and becomes choice. When you no longer see it as punishment, but as opportunity, fear transforms into freedom. Loneliness then becomes a space where your purpose blooms, where you hear your desires without outside noise, where you learn that your worth does not depend on being accompanied. Of course, at first it may feel uncomfortable, like a house too big where suddenly all the lights go out. But if you light a candle, you realize the darkness wasn't so terrible. That candle is you. Your ability to be with yourself is the light that changes the way you see solitude. And I'll leave you with a reflection to close this point. Maybe all your life you feared ending up alone. But isn't it far more terrifying to stay with someone who robs you of your peace? True loneliness is not the absence of others, it's the absence of yourself. And when you choose to leave in silence, you reclaim that intimate meeting with yourself, the one that was always waiting. Number 8, your body finally rests. The curious thing about carrying toxic bonds is that the body always speaks before the mind. You can convince yourself that it's not that bad, that it will work itself out, but the body doesn't lie. Insomnia, chest tightness, shoulder tension, constant fatigue, they're all ways of screaming what you don't want to hear. And when you disappear in silence, when you finally stop exposing yourself to that drain, your body begins to let go. I experienced it firsthand. For months, I dragged myself through sleepless nights, with circular thoughts spinning endlessly in my head. The day I decided to cut things off completely and stay silent, nothing magical happened right away, but within days I began to feel it. I slept more deeply, I woke up with less anxiety, my breathing felt lighter. It was as if my body had been waiting for permission to rest. Science explains it well. When you live under relational stress, your sympathetic nervous system, the one that keeps you on alert, stays switched on all the time. Your heart beats faster, your muscles tense, your digestion is disrupted. It's like running a marathon without ever reaching the finish line. But when you cut contact and choose silence, that system gradually switches off, and the body recovers its natural rhythm of rest. One night I confirmed it in the simplest way. I had cut off contact and, instead of checking my phone before bed, I did something different. I breathed deeply, eyes closed, counting to 4 as I inhaled and to 6 as I exhaled. I repeated it about 10 times. The next morning, I woke up surprised, realizing I hadn't tossed and turned all night. That's when I understood. Calm wasn't in the other person. Calm was mine all along, but I could only reclaim it once I let go of the rope. Here's a simple exercise for you. Before bed, try a small ritual. Turn off all screens, dim the lights, breathe deeply for 5 minutes, and write down 3 things you're grateful for that day. They don't have to be big. Something as small as enjoying a hot coffee or seeing sunlight through the window is enough. This ritual not only relaxes your mind, it also teaches your body that it doesn't need to stay on guard anymore. Because silence doesn't just heal emotions, it heals tissues, hormones, and organs. The rest that comes after cutting ties with what harms you is a full-body rest. It's the difference between sleeping with an alarm blaring at your side and sleeping knowing no one will interrupt. That's the gift of disappearing in silence. Your body stops being at war, and when the body rests, the soul also finds a place to breathe. Number 9. Your purpose returns, and the focus on what you can control. When you disappear in silence, something unexpected happens. Suddenly you realize just how much energy you were giving away to a relationship that had no way out. All that attention spent on explaining, arguing, defending yourself, or trying to change the other person comes back to you. And with that energy restored, something reappears, something you may have forgotten, your purpose. I experienced this after a long period of exhaustion where it seemed like my entire life revolved around the problem with that person. When I walked away in silence, I found myself with free hours and with an emptiness that at first felt frightening. But little by little, that emptiness turned into fertile ground. I started writing again, picked up books I had left unfinished, and even launched a personal project I had put on hold for years. That's when I understood what the Stoics taught. The only thing that truly matters is what is under your control. And when you stop trying to control someone else, you rediscover everything you can actually do for yourself. Here's a practical tool that helped me a lot. Draw 3 circles on a sheet of paper. In the first, write down what is under your control, your decisions, your time, your way of responding. In the second, what you can influence but not decide completely, your health, your habits, your relationships. And in the third, what never depends on you, the past, other people's opinions, their emotions. Every time your mind gets tangled in what you can't control, look at that paper and remind yourself where your real power lies. To illustrate this, I like a fable I heard years ago. A craftsman had a workshop covered in dust because he spent his days arguing in the town square with his neighbors, until one day he noticed his tools were rusting and his creations unfinished. So he decided to close his mouth, stop fighting, and return to his workshop. Over time, his works began to shine again, and people came to see him, not to argue, but to admire what he was capable of building in silence. That's exactly what happens when you choose to disappear. You stop wasting your life in the square of conflict and return to your own workshop. You recover projects, passions, ideas that seem forgotten. And most importantly, you start to feel once again that your life belongs to you, not as a chessboard in someone else's hands. Stoic philosophy sums it up in a phrase I always carry with me: do what you must, let happen what may. That's the essence of redirecting your energy. When you stop wasting it on what you can't change, you focus it on what you can, your character, your habits, your purpose. And when your purpose returns, life regains its deeper meaning. It's no longer about winning arguments or having the last word. It's about living with coherence, letting your time and your energy build something of real value. That's the power of leaving in silence, finding your way back to the center of your own path. Number 10, your social circle reshapes itself. When you choose to disappear in silence from a relationship that was draining you, it's not just the dynamic with that person that changes. Your whole environment rearranges. It's like moving one domino piece and watching the rest fall into a new order. And at first, this can feel unsettling, because you start to see who truly draws close, who drifts away, and who was only there out of convenience or habit. I noticed this firsthand. As soon as I stopped being available for someone's dramas, certain friendships began to fade too. Not because those people were bad, but because their bond with me was built around the same toxic circle. It was uncomfortable, yes, but at the same time, liberating. Because what remained was far more genuine. Friends who were there for me, not for the echo of my conflicts. To understand this reordering, I like to think of it in layers. Imagine 3 concentric circles. In the center are your closest bonds, the ones who hold you up quietly, with whom you can be yourself without masks. In the second layer are allies, people you share interests and projects with, even if there isn't deep intimacy. And in the third are acquaintances, those with whom you keep a cordial relationship, but without great commitments. When you step away from a harmful relationship, those circles inevitably shift. Sometimes someone from the center moves to the edge, and sometimes someone unexpected comes closer to the core. In my experience, this reshuffling also brings surprises. A person you once thought of as distant can become very close because now you have energy to give them real quality time. And on the flip side, someone you saw every day might disappear because their presence was tied to that draining cycle. And that's okay. It's part of life's natural order. Nothing remains static. The key is learning to let go without resentment. Not everyone who drifts away is an enemy. Sometimes they simply complete their cycle. Life has a rhythm that doesn't always match our expectations. What matters is to accept with calm that your social circle reorganizes itself according to your new inner state. When you change, your relationships change too. Here's a concrete practice I want to suggest. Take a sheet of paper and draw your 3 layers of connections. Write names in each circle according to the closeness you actually feel today, not what you used to feel. Then ask yourself, who belongs at the center because they hold me with love? Who should move to the second layer? Who would I like to bring closer? This exercise brings clarity and frees you from guilt. Disappearing in silence is not just an act of breaking away, it's an act of order. The noise fades, the masks fall, and what remains is your real, genuine, balanced circle. And while it may hurt at first, over time you'll be grateful for this reshaping because it lays the foundation for healthier, more authentic connections. Number 11. The other person goes through their stages, and they're not your problem. When you disappear in silence, the other person doesn't remain indifferent. Their mind and emotions enter a whirlwind of phases very similar to grief. First usually comes anger. How dare you not answer? Who do you think you are to leave like this? Then comes bargaining, sudden messages, promises to change, declarations that sound sincere, but are born more from fear of losing you than from true transformation. After that comes sadness, and sometimes indifference. All of this is part of a natural process, but here's the essential truth. None of it is your responsibility. I've seen it many times with the people I've guided. Someone would take a brave step, cut off contact, and then the other person would overflow with attempts to regain control. One day, full of reproaches, the next, full of praise. A back and forth that, if you're not prepared, can drag you right back into the cycle of exhaustion. But when you understand that those stages belong to them, not to you, you manage to stay firm in your decision. Personally, I remember the first time I lived through this pattern up close. I was surprised to get a message after weeks of silence. Now I understand everything. I want to change. And the very next day, another one completely opposite. You were always the problem. If I hadn't been clear, maybe I would have doubted my choice. But I realized what I was seeing wasn't love. It was fear. The other person's fear of being left alone with their own reflection. This is where the Stoic virtue of courage becomes indispensable. Courage isn't shouting or going to battle. Courage is holding your decision without giving in to someone else's emotional storms. Because yes, it can be hard to watch the other go through those stages. It may stir up compassion, guilt, or even the temptation to explain yourself again. But don't forget, your job is not to rescue them from their process. Your job is to stay on your path of dignity and peace. If you want a practical tool, prepare internal responses for those moments. You don't need to send anything, but you can say clear phrases to yourself. This emotion is not mine. It's not my role to save them. My silence is also self-love. These reminders work like anchors when their tide tries to pull you back in. Remember, their stages are not your stage. You've already stepped off the theater, you've already closed the door. What remains on stage belongs to them. And even if they try to shout to you from afar, you have no obligation to return. Because real strength lies in understanding that everyone must live their own process. And yours now is to protect your peace. Number 12. You see the pattern from the outside, When you were inside the dynamic, everything felt like confusing chaos. The arguments, the tense silences, the quick reconciliations, the reproaches. It was like staring at a painting too closely. Nothing but meaningless smudges. But when you decide to leave in silence, you gain distance. And from that distance, the pattern becomes clear. You realize that what seemed unpredictable was actually the same cycle repeating itself again and again. I went through this after a draining relationship where I thought every fight was different. One time it was about money, another about jealousy, another about misunderstandings. Until one day, far away from that person, I started connecting the dots. There was always a trigger, a build-up of tension, a direct attack, and then the reconciliation with promises. It was a recycled script. The only thing that changed were the secondary characters. And I realized that I was part of that script too, because I kept agreeing to play my role. Silence gives you that perspective. It's like climbing up to a balcony and looking down at the whole play. You can see the beginnings, the twists, the endings, and most importantly, the repetitions. That understanding isn't meant to make you blame yourself, but to help you learn. Because once you identify a pattern, you hold the key to never falling into it again. Here's a practical exercise I often recommend. Draw a diagram of the cycle. On a sheet of paper, write down the typical stages of the relationship with specific examples. What happened, what you felt, how you reacted. Don't stay vague. Write dates, quotes, details. Then step back and look. What triggered everything? Which emotions kept repeating? Which of your own choices kept the cycle alive? This practice hurts, but it opens your eyes in a brutal, honest way. I remember a quote from Seneca that I found in an old notebook. "He who stumbles twice on the same stone deserves to fall." Reading it made me realize I'd been tripping over the same dynamic for years, just with different names. Silence gave me the chance to look at the stone from afar and finally walk around it. The beauty of seeing the pattern from the outside is that it gives you back your power. You're no longer the victim of someone else's chaos. You're the observer of a repetitive play. And from that position, you can choose not to buy tickets to that show ever again. That's why disappearing in silence doesn't just cut the cycle in the present, it also protects you in the future. Because once you recognize the script, you learn to read the first pages before the story pulls you back in. And that is wisdom in action, using your experience, even the painful kind, to write a different life. Number 13. You raise your standards without resentment. When you choose to leave in silence, what you're really doing is redefining your worth. You're making it clear that you won't accept less than what you deserve. And the most interesting part is that this act doesn't come from hate or a desire for revenge. It comes from a simple recognition. You're no longer willing to negotiate your dignity. I experienced this after a relationship that had drained me to the bone. At the moment I walked away, I thought I was carrying resentment. But what came with time was something else. Clarity. Clarity about what I do want in my life and what I will never again allow. That clarity didn't show up as rigid rules, but as a calm certainty, like closing the door to your home, knowing that only what builds peace is allowed inside. There's a biblical verse that accompanied me during that process, one I never forgot. Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Proverbs 4:23. It struck me because I realized the heart isn't protected with speeches or promises. It's protected with decisions. And disappearing in silence was, for me, one of the most protective decisions I could make. What happens afterward is revealing. You start to notice signs in other relationships that you used to ignore. Small acts of disrespect you once justified, manipulative silences you once endured. Now, with your standards raised, you simply say, no. No shouting, no arguing, no long explanations. Because when you raise the level of what you accept, you no longer need to fight to defend it. Your life itself becomes the filter. Here's a simple practice for you. Make a personal checklist of non-negotiables. Things as simple as, I want someone who respects my time. I want to speak without fear. I want to feel calm, not anxious. Write them down and keep them. Each time you meet someone new, or even review your current relationships, compare them with that list. It's not about demanding perfection, but about being clear on your standard of dignity. The beauty of this process is that you don't get trapped in resentment. It's not about hating the one who failed you, it's about loving yourself enough not to repeat the story. Resentment enslaves, but standards set you free. Because you're no longer reacting from the wound, you're choosing from awareness. That's how disappearing in silence becomes an act of planting. Planting self-respect, planting clarity, planting peace. And what grows from that soil can only be healthier, cleaner, and more dignified relationships. Number 14, you speak less, you communicate more. One of the greatest revelations that silence brings is realizing you don't need many words to deliver a clear message. In fact, the more you talk to justify yourself, the more room you give the other person to twist your words. But when you learn to say just enough, or even nothing at all, your communication becomes so sharp that there's no space left for manipulation. I remember an email I received years ago. It was full of complaints, demands, and phrases designed to trap me in an endless argument. Before, I would have written a 3-page reply trying to explain every point. That day, instead, I answered with a single line. I'm not available for this kind of conversation. Period. There was no possible comeback, because there was nothing left to drain. That short phrase carried more weight than an entire novel. Stoicism teaches this practically through the virtue of temperance, knowing how to measure not only what you do, but what you say. Because temperance is not repression, it's the wisdom to choose when to speak and when to stay silent. And believe me, there are silences that shout louder than any speech. If you want to train this skill, try a small personal exercise. Whenever someone provokes you, before responding, ask yourself 3 things. 1. Does what I'm about to say bring peace or feed the conflict? 2. Am I speaking from the wound or from calm? 3. Do I really need to answer, or is silence enough already? 9 times out of 10, you'll realize there's nothing to say. This doesn't mean turning into a cold or closed-off person. It means that when you do speak, your words will be so precise that they leave no doubt. Simple examples. I can't. I don't agree. Thank you, but no. Short messages, without embellishments, without extra explanations. Those phrases carry a power that long defenses never will. The curious thing is that this style of communication doesn't just set boundaries, it restores your dignity. Because you're no longer standing on someone else's ground, debating their version of the story. You're standing on your own, showing with calm clarity what you allow and what you don't. So when you choose to speak less and communicate more, you discover that clarity doesn't need decoration, that your silence can be your strongest statement, and that your few words can become anchors of self-respect. Because in a world where everyone talks too much, learning to stay silent at the right time is the wisest way to communicate. Number 15, you open space for healthy relationships. When you disappear in silence from a relationship that was harming you, it's not just an act of loss, it's above all an act of opening. Because by letting go of what no longer adds to your life, you clear the ground for new, healthier, more balanced connections to grow. It's like clearing a garden full of weeds. At first it hurts to pull out what's been there, even the dry parts, but only then can something fresh and full of life take root. I met an older woman who told me her story with a particular sparkle in her eyes. After decades in a suffocating marriage, one day she decided to leave in silence, without reproaches, without speeches. At first, she felt lost, as if walking through a desert. But little by little, in that same silence, new friendships appeared. Neighbors she began walking with, a reading group at the library, even a grandson who started visiting her more often because now he felt her peace. She told me, I was afraid of being alone, but I had never been so truly accompanied. Silence, then, is not emptiness. It is space. Space for more authentic connections, for relationships where you no longer have to beg for attention or justify your worth. Space for people who come into your life not because of what you're forced to give, but because of what you share with joy. And here Stoic wisdom comes in. You can't control who stays and who leaves, but you can choose to open your life only to what contributes to your serenity. Here's a simple visualization. Close your eyes and imagine your life as a table. Before, it was crowded with arguments, reproaches, and tense silences. Today, you see it cleared. And now, different people begin to sit at that table. Someone you laugh with, someone you can speak to without fear, someone who respects your silences. Look at that table and feel it as yours. That is the future that begins when you choose to walk away without words. Stoicism speaks of 4 virtues: wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance, and all of them are alive here. Wisdom to recognize what doesn't serve you, justice to give yourself what you deserve, courage to leave, and temperance to create space calmly. That balance is what makes it possible for healthy connections to flourish. And I want to close this point with one certainty. Your silence doesn't isolate you, it prepares you. It prepares you for relationships that are more human, more honest, more luminous. Because by disappearing from what depletes you, you make room for what uplifts you. And in that new space, you finally discover that it was never too late to surround yourself with relationships that are truly worth it. We've walked a deep path together. I've shared with you 15 truths that awaken when you choose to disappear in silence from a life that no longer sustains you. We discovered how the power game breaks, how you force the other person to face their own mirror, how you regain your peace of mind and give your body the rest it needs. We saw that silence is the clearest boundary, that you don't need closure to heal, that by staying quiet you change the narrative, learn to be with yourself, and rediscover your purpose. We also talked about how your social circle reshapes itself, how the other person goes through their own stages, how you begin to see patterns from the outside, and how you raise your standards. And finally, we understood that by speaking less, you communicate more, and that by leaving without noise, you open space for healthy connections. If you look closely, this journey was never just about the other. It was about you, about reclaiming your power, your dignity, your silence as both shield and seed. Because silence is not emptiness, it is fertile ground. It is the soil where wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance take root, the 4 virtues that remind us we can always live with serenity, even in the middle of chaos. I want to thank you sincerely for staying with me until the end, for allowing me to accompany you on this intimate philosophical path. I'm Gabriel, and this space, the Stoic Garden, exists to remind you that it's never too late to return to yourself, to live with wisdom and self-love. I invite you to leave a comment telling me which country you're connecting from, so we can continue discovering where this wonderful community of truth seekers is blooming. And today I want to suggest writing down a phrase to seal what you've learned. My silence is power. Let it stand as your commitment to peace, to dignity, and to purpose. Share this video with a sister, a friend, or someone who may be needing this message. You never know when these words might be the relief someone was waiting for. Thank you for being part of this conversation. Now you'll see 2 more videos on your screen that I'm sure you'll enjoy. Choose one, and let's keep learning together how to bring wisdom into life in a simple, practical way.